Welcome to week 5 of MPAI 600 here at Georgetown University. The only announcement, paper briefing due February 12th, and I'll go with a lot more guidance right in this video. But just keep in mind, again, something to work on this week. So, review of last week. So again, two topics, Iraq WMD and the 9/11 case study. And as we talked about, where were the failures? You can point to many aspects. The Iraq WMD case study. There's collection failures. You saw the documentary on Curveball. You saw other collection failures regarding the inability to collect information, the over-reliance on like a single source like Curveball because you didn't have other aspects to collect back then. There were analytical failures. The aluminum tubes come to mind for that case study where it was both a combination of groupthink, poor technical analysis that led those aluminum tubes to be characterized as centrifuges, a critical part of a nuclear program, and not on rocket motors, which is what they were. So those are kind of analytical failures, and you can point to groupthink. You can point to negative evidence where we didn't ask the question of if you take the aluminum tubes example, negative evidence says, well, we didn't ask the question, if they're starting a nuclear program, why aren't we seeing much more? And that was a key analytical failure. Everyone focused on the aluminum tubes or the other aspects of the intelligence. They didn't ask, if Hussein is conducting a biological weapons program, why aren't we seeing a lot more data out there? So that's a kind of an analytical failure. Organizational failures. In the documentary, the Rachel Maddow documentary, you saw that a lot of the information was filtered through George Tenet. And if it wasn't filtered through him, the Department of Defense set up different intelligence structures to kind of get the answers that they were looking for. That's an organizational failure. If one, you're over-relying on George Tenet, or you're separating multiple intelligence structures to try and find an answer, that's a problem in organization. And then the policy interface. The Rachel Maddow documentary gives a pretty good overview on this. I'm not going to go into detail, but you have to ask the question. We can talk about the collection failures and analytical failures. Would those have become failures if not for the political impetus to try and look for rationales to invade Iraq? And was the information communicated properly from the intelligence community with all the nuances and all the other aspects to the policymakers, and would the policymakers have been receptive to that? Those are all aspects of the Iraq WMD case study that you can go in depth in your paper. And then 9/11. I bring this up, was 9/11 an intelligence failure? And as I mentioned in my lecture, yes, because we had data on these two, Hamzi and Midar, and we had information on them, but we couldn't share it with the rest of the government, the action arms that could have done something to unravel the 9/11 plot. That is an intelligence, that I would consider an intelligence failure. I asked this, what to do if bin Laden determined to attack in the U.S.? And I put yourself in this scenario, you brief that to the president, and the president comes to you and says, okay, what do you want me to do? How do you solve that problem? How do you answer that problem? Should you answer that problem? I would say yes. If you're going to come in with that analysis, expect an answer coming back from the president and say, what do I do now? And then the organizational issues. The NSA documentary goes into this depth. We had information, we had communications between San Diego and a known bin Laden safe house in Yemen. And that was being monitored by the NSA, that there was communications already in our country. But that was not shared because of bureaucracy and classification issues with the action arms, the FBI, local law enforcement that could have actually done something. And then I ask, as you're going along, where along the chain could federal, state, local officials have prevented a 9/11? What would be the impetus? And we're going to keep asking this question. I want you to talk about it in your final if you talk about 9/11. Where was there enough information, intelligence, that federal, state, local officials could have made decisions that stopped the 9/11 plot? Where do you think there was enough reasonable information going forward? So that's one thing to look at for this case study, as well as the previous case studies as well. So give you a guidance on the paper. Again, we have the case studies. If you're going to do something outside the case studies, tell me now. But I think the case studies provide you enough information to go on this, to go through the final. So I will allow you to choose an intelligence issue or choose a case study. And for those of you, just to delineate, you could choose groupthink or negative evidence and show how all the case studies exhibited negative evidence and how that was a continued problem, whether you're talking about Pearl Harbor, the Confessions, Yom Kippur War. So you could focus on a case study or on a intelligence issue, or you can go in depth on something like Pearl Harbor or something like Yom Kippur War. I'll leave that up to you going forward. What I want you to do is focus on 1 to 2 aspects. Do not give me a laundry list. Do not give me a laundry list. I do not want, here are the 8 reasons why Pearl Harbor happened. Here are the 8 reasons why 9/11 happened. I want you to choose what you think were the primary reasons it happened and then go in depth. I really want you to think through it. And the discussion points, you might have listed indicators and you might have listed, 10 reasons why 9/11 happened. That is all fine in the discussion section. In the paper, I'm expecting much, much more depth. So I'll make sure that's clear. So again, a couple of things that you could focus on. Again, I'm going to give you a list here. I don't want you to just go down this laundry list. I want you to choose. So we talked about failures in collection. You can make the argument that Pearl Harbor was a result of a failure in collection because we did not know where the 6 aircraft carriers were. Yom Kippur War, poor humant, the over-reliance on Narwan and the inability to collect on your adversary could have been the primary cause for this intelligence failure. And then the Iraq War, again, I just talked about curveball and an over-reliance on there. Failures in analysis, again, the Pearl Harbor case study, when you think about groupthink and their over-reliance on, let's just say, racist intelligence, that is a failure in analysis. Failure to interpret the signals properly. You can go in depth in there. The confessions, again, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Groupthink, confirmation bias, negative evidence, vividness bias. All those were aspects of the confessions that resulted in that, intel failure going forward. And then Iraq MD, I just talked about the groupthink in relation to whether it's the aluminum tubes or curveball or any of those aspects of the WMD case study there. Politicization. Again, we talked about the failures occurring in the politicization level or the interface between policymakers. The Iraq WMD case study, I don't think I need to go in depth. You just study that past week. Confessions. You can make the argument that there was too much information on Detective Ford and there was political pressure to get an arrest, and that's why he came up with such bad evidence, as you saw in that case study. And then the 9/11 case study, you could talk about the inability to communicate the threat of Al-Qaeda and the foreign terrorism threat to senior leaders, that they didn't have enough push to do so, and that's why 9/11 happened. Now, I'll let you decide if that's true or not. And then organization. Again, the 9/11, as I talked about, there was enough intelligence, arguably, but it wasn't shared from the NSA to other aspects, as you saw in that documentary. Pearl Harbor, one of the arguments you can make is that there was enough information collected on Japanese threat and intentions at the federal level, but because of bureaucracy and organizational issues, it was not shared down to the commanders on the ground that could have actually done something. And then finally, you could talk about the fusion centers, which are supposed to mitigate some of the 9/11 case studies. That information is supposed to be pushed down to the lowest level so that state and local officials and tribal officials are well aware of the intelligence. I'll let you go in depth in that, but you can also argue, despite the billions we spent on the fusion centers, we still have, all the intelligence failures you've seen, whether it's Orlando or San Bernardino or some of the other domestic the congressional attack or some other domestic intelligence failure. So that's the paper in depth. If you have any questions or issues, don't hesitate to contact me, but I think I've given you enough guidance. Again, don't just rehash all this I just gave you. Choose what you think the primary failure is and go in depth. And also tell me, especially if you're going to talk about those strategic surprise case studies, what could have been done from the operational perspective? What could Israel have done to better prepare to prevent the Arab attack? What could have the commanders at Pearl Harbor have done? You have to tell me what the intelligence should have driven. So that covers the paper. Unfortunately, because it's a compressed schedule, we have to just keep going with the units. So you have the paper as well as this due. And we're going to talk about the counterterrorism case studies, Fort Hood, underwear bomber, Boston, and the European Union. You have the readings, the Fort Hood shooting and the Boston Marathon bombing, and then the two documentaries, both excellent documentaries, very excellent, and they're, I don't want to say entertaining, but if you have a significant other, they might be interested in it as well, so you can make it a movie night if you want. And the question to think about is why we still have these failures, whether it's the case studies that we're going to talk about or the lone wolves that have been prevalent in the last few years. So that's week 5. I look forward to reading your papers next week, but I think you've given you enough guidance, and if there's questions or issues, don't hesitate to contact me.